Hello, my name is John McCargill, and this is my PowerPoint on the Federal Reserve. We'll start with some historical background. The Federal Reserve was signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson on December 23rd, 1913 by the Federal Reserve Act. Its purpose was to stabilize the economy in terms of bank runs and the liquidity problem from the early 1900s. And in 1977, the Federal Reserve was amended by Congress to have a dual mandate where it would manage employment, inflation, and stabilizing prices. Furthermore, there are some key components to the Federal Reserve, and below we see the Board of Governors, which is the seven members approved by the President and confirmed by Congress. Each member has a 14-year term, which can help combat political bias in terms of short-term leaders. And their main objective is to supervise and regulate the entire U.S. banking system. We have 12 regional banks, and each of them operate in a sort of a semi-private governmental manner, and they're designed to take into consideration regional economic data. And then we have the Federal Open Market Committee, who establishes the policies in which all other banks in the United States are affected, which then trickles down and affects the civilian population. So, like in 1913, the original purpose was to address liquidity problems, and further down the road, it developed other purposes, such as maintaining the currency's liquidity in the market, putting and taking away money to control inflation, supervising the U.S. banking, maximizing employment, stabilizing prices, and the big one, balancing inflation while maintaining the rest. To help regulate the economy, the Fed has a couple of tools at its hand. Obviously, the first one is the interest on reserve balances, which is where the banks can hold a reserve and they get interest from the Federal Reserve in exchange for holding those reserves. We have an overnight reverse repurchase agreement, which is where non-banks can deposit cash in exchange for a rate of return. We have a discount rate, which is where the discount rate is where the interest rate in the Fed to loan money to other member banks. We have open market operations, which is when they're actively trading with quantitative easing, and that's used to make it to where we're not totally reliant on interest rates. And then we have reserves, which are backups to prevent bank runs and other things that can be addressed with liquidity issues. However, these have become sort of obsolete as we develop better tools and algorithms and ideas to combat those problems. So the Fed has a problem in that it needs to remain politically neutral because it's mostly math-based, or it's data-driven. So at the end of it all, the Fed has to report to Congress, and it is ultimately designed to be self-funded and operate independently, but it still has a boss that has to report to at the end of the day to address those political indifferences. They also are given that 14-year term, which will be a reoccurring theme. And that 14-year term is very powerful. And then also at the end of the day, the FOMC, they are ultimately in charge of the actual policy that gets put in place. And again, we see that the Fed is data driven, and they have those 14-year terms to combat political indifference, and they often have this inherent ability where they can create their own divisions to lobby on their behalf, which can lead to some strong political defense. Some pros of the Fed's independence is its limited outside influence. Helps eliminate some of that bias that could come in from outside sources, such as the President of the United States. Um, they can make decisions without time being a critical factor, 14 years, and they can think in long term and not necessarily have to worry about the short term. They don't consider the typical political cycle very much. They know it affects it, but at the end of the day, they have a job to do that's not politically motivated all the time. And they can focus on long-term growth instead of the short-term wins, which in the long term, obviously, as it says, is what their goal is. Some of the cons of the Fed's independence are the natural necessity of inflation. Um, Sometimes the Fed can also have a tendency to lean towards centralization because they become a specialized group of bankers. Citizens cannot necessarily cast a vote um, to hold those who run the Fed accountable, and it is still a law that can be removed, and that can sometimes be seen as a disadvantage instead of always an advantage. Some of the weaknesses of the Fed is that it's not protected by the U.S. Constitution. It can be decommissioned by congressional vote. They have difficulty predicting short-term economic change. However, they can influence long-term change. It's difficult to determine who can be responsible for a particular decision if it goes south. And voting is generally a major weakness because citizens don't get to vote on that behalf. And sometimes they're subject to a moral hazard where they can create a policy that doesn't necessarily favor citizens and the public. The Fed's relationship to Congress is that Congress maintains superior oversight. They ensure that those goals are met and that the Feds are doing, in fact, those goals. However, they do understand that the Fed is an entity that was created by Congress, and so Congress generally tries to respect that and tries not to get involved with the monetary policy, considering that they made a side institution to take care of that for them. The presidential relationship to the Fed is that the president and the Fed typically bump heads a little bit. Um, and the Fed is a powerful, and it is correct in sticking to its data. And but sometimes it could be true that the president might be right in terms of certain financial policies, given the political climate that the Fed might not necessarily take advantage of in consideration. However, the presidential bias is far greater than anyone in the Fed's chair. Um, the president knows what the public wants, and that doesn't always match what the Fed's data shows. Um, and typically, the Fed stands by its data, and um, there's a lot of pressure to keep that going. In my conclusion, it seems that the Fed is not perfect and has likely not seen every scenario in its own trials and tribulations. The Fed has historically done great in terms of maintaining its own accountability and keeping the math grounded in data. And while the Fed is independent, it still needs strong leadership to combat harsh political climates and unfaltering fiscal algorithms.